Sego sewa gwego, yung Yastin Porter, and yota aga ni soda, swega ni wageno, okwali ni wagita loda. Hello, everyone. My name is Tim Porter. I am a member of the Oneida Nation of the Six Nations of the Grand River, and I am also a member of the Bear Clan. Now, today I'm going to be talking about tribal agricultural outreach. It's a framework for approaching effective partnerships, and I always like to introduce myself in my native language when I get the opportunity. Um, but I'm a recent graduate of Colorado State University, as Danielle said, with my bachelor's degree in psychology. And I am Ongwe Hongwe, as we say in my community, or native. And I fostered an interest in Indigenous community-led research. Now, I am so sorry, but I think I opened up the wrong presentation. So give me 1 second here. Let me get the right one up.
You're all good, Tim. Take your time.
Nah, thank you. There we go. Do you guys see it?
Looks good? Yes.
Awesome. All right, perfect. So as I said, I'm interested in creating a framework, a repeatable framework for other organizations, outreach professionals to follow and trying to kind of pursue these types of
Did it work?
partnerships.
Nice.
Perfect. Okay, let's see. Okay. There we go. All right. So, first off, why did I want to kind of present on this topic? Well, I saw an overlap, between my interests and the mission of my organization, which really led to this project. So, as was mentioned previously, I've been at the High Plains Intermountain Center for Agricultural Health and Safety for about 4 years now, and I've worked as an outreach assistant. Um, so, in addition to those outreach responsibilities like community engagement, education, and resource development, I saw opportunity in really expanding our network. So I approached our director, Dr. Lorraine Stallings, and my supervisor, Whitney Pennington, about pursuing a project aimed at establishing relationships with tribal stakeholders. So, over the last few years, I've been working on this project, which has evolved over that time and also led to a series of different presentations for Native organizations. So, this project I'm referring to is going to be the outline I'll be presenting today. So I didn't just want to pursue these partnerships, right? I wanted to be thoughtful about my approach. So today I'll begin with a very brief history of one of the most impactful tribal relationships, that with the federal government. And with this, I hope to provide some important, albeit broad, context of Native experiences. Then I want to paint another broad picture of Native communities I'm speaking about today, and then I will discuss my framework that guided my project and its development. And next, I will share some examples from my work to help illustrate that framework. And finally, I want to leave everyone with some important takeaways and the lessons that I learned along the way. So, now, given that the time we have is brief, I'm going to speak very broadly about the history of the relationship between the U.S. government and tribal nations. So, this relationship is unique. Chief Justice John Marshall, you can see here in this particular quote, described as peculiar. This was echoed in a 1990s Supreme Court case where it was referred to as anomalous. And what they're really referring to is the nature of treaty making with tribal nations that the U.S. undertook. And in these Supreme Court cases, this is where we kind of get a clear delineation of domestic dependent nationhood or sovereignty of these tribal communities. So They're referring to that treaty making. And so, as the U.S. acquired that tribal territory, it also incurred moral and legal obligations. So, of these 367 ratified treaties, many were intended to last forever. So, to understand this relationship with tribal nations, we can really think of federal Indian policy as seven distinct eras with some overlap between one another. So, let's start there. So first we have the treaty making era. And this is where the U.S. first recognized tribal nations as sovereign entities and where a lot of those initial treaties were created. Following this, we have the removal era. And this is where the U.S. expanded westward, acquiring more tribal territory. And this also includes the Indian Removal Act of 1830, as we know, which led to the Trail of Tears. Then we have the reservation era. And this is where tribes were confined to specific geographic locations called reservations, and often not within their ancestral territories, and often on, less than arable land, we'll say. So many of the agreements made during this time were made under duress relating to external challenges and conflict. So this era is also notable for what we may already be familiar with on this in this room is the Morrill Act of 1862. And this established those land grant universities, which are really aimed to support U.S. agriculture. Now, following this, we can think of this as the allotment and assimilation era. And this is where we see the changing relationship between U.S. and tribal nations, that kind of so-called paternalistic approach to Native communities. So this is also where we see the establishment of Indian boarding schools or the residential school era. And it was really, especially in the US, it was organized around this idea from Richard Henry Pratt, who was famously quoted for saying, kill the Indian in him to save the man. And so this is also where we see the Dawes Act. And the Dawes Act, it redistributed tribally owned land to individual land ownership. And it forced Native communities, individuals, even those with no prior experience, to adopt Western agricultural practices. Now, this was replaced by the Indian Reorganization era. This is characterized by US imposed Western style governments onto tribal nations. So tribal nations had to adopt their own constitutions and operate in a similar way to the US government at that time. So this also reversed a lot of the previous era's very destructive land allotment policy. So this is where we see the changing of hands of the lands from the individual to more tribal ownership. And next is the termination era. And this is where the federal government aimed to reduce their financial obligations by terminating tribal recognition. This is also the era of relocation, where many families were relocated to urban areas for assimilation, usually under the promise of paid training, employment, and housing, and which, of course, meant much of which did not actually come to fruition. Um, These policies were, of course, legally challenged. They were, for example, fought by the Menominee tribe in 1973, who were able to successfully fight for the reinstatement of their federal recognition. And then finally, we can kind of think of most recent era as the self-determination era, following the staunch resistance to termination policies. So this emphasized tribal self-governance, more kind of a going back to traditional types of governance, and economic development, leveraging resources to build that social and food sovereignty. Now, agriculture and land use has played a critical role throughout this entire relationship between the federal government and tribal nations, up to and including today. So it's a lot there, but how does this all relate to establishing partnerships with tribal nations? I think it's important to take a step back and take a look at what we covered. In less than 250 years, about 8 generations, an entire community, a group of people experienced that destabilization, and then they adapted and readapted and readapted. So, some natives might harbor some reservations when it comes to partnerships with institutions. These also contextualize some of the challenges faced when seeking partnerships and why one must be thoughtful about how to go about it. Now, myself, as I mentioned, I'm a member of the Oneida Nation. I grew up on a reservation, and I recently heard someone say that every Native person you meet is a survivor of Indian boarding schools. And that's not necessarily because they attended themselves, right? But because the diaspora of trauma felt in these institutions continue to resonate through families and communities today. In my own family, my dad was the youngest of a large family. His older siblings, my uncles and aunties, and my grandparents on both sides, my mom included, all attended the Mohawk Institute. Many of our people refer to this as the mush hole, which is really in reference to the quality of food that they fed the children at that time. So that experience is not ancient history to me. It exists within living memory in my family and, of course, myself. And some of the attendees are still even alive today. So I share that not to suggest that every Native community has the same story or perspective, but to really illustrate why context matters. When we approach tribal nations and Native communities, we are not beginning our relationship from a blank slate. We are entering into a history of interactions with governments, schools, universities, churches, and other institutions. So I think that understanding that history helps us understand why trust cannot be assumed, why relationships often take time to develop, and why listening is just as important as providing our services. So context doesn't tell us everything we need to know about the individual or community or how they'll respond. It simply helps us appreciate the experiences that may shape how partnerships are received. When we understand that context, we can approach our work with greater humility, patience, and of course, above all else, respect. And I just want to note here in the pictures, the Mohawk Institute, the mush hole, is the picture that you see on the right side. The left one is the more famous Carlisle Institute here in the US. Now, first, I want to provide a broad overview of the communities I am referring to. So, you are all probably familiar with the term American Indian or Alaska Native, and it's something I'll use interchangeably. When I say tribal stakeholders, I am not referring to only to a unique, ethnic or racial group. I'm referring to that sovereign political entity as outlined in the US Constitution and further defined through these series of treaties. So, really, up until now, we've been spending a great deal of time talking about the history of Native people. And now I want to bring us back to the present. So, in the 2020 census, 1.1% of people claimed American Indian or Alaska Native identity, and with even higher numbers for people who claim part American Indian and Alaska Native identity. And not to catch myself when I was putting together this presentation because now there are 575 federally recognized tribes in the US, with over 100 that are state recognized. And I won't go into like any of the underlying machinations of that process, but there are still many tribes that are unrecognized. And also thanks to the detailed work of Dais and Mark, we have a more accurate estimate, placing Native people living in rural areas or small towns around 54%. So just about half of the Native community live in these small towns or rural areas. And so important to a lot of the work that we do, 2% of the producers surveyed at the 2022 USDA census identified as American Indian or Alaska Native. So I want to explore that population a little bit more and just briefly. So when we really think about U.S. agriculture, right, we often do not think about Native communities or producers. And yet, more than 78,000 producers identified as American Indian or Alaska Native in the USDA census. So Native producers exist in every region of the country with a lot of the representation throughout the Great Plains, Southwest, and Alaska. The USDA reports, as I seen on the previous slide, that 70% of the producers specialize in livestock. And so at the same time, right, this community is often overlooked, underserved, and underrepresented in agricultural programming, education, and research. So, in work I cited previously, Dewey's and Mark, this phenomena is often referred to as twice invisible. So that is to say that invisible as a native and also as a producer. Um, and this is also where outreach specialists, educators, extension professionals, um, when they want to build these relationships or partnership with tribal stakeholders, right? It's not a focus on a niche population is a focus in a significant and growing part of the larger agricultural community. And further, this type of work, it's not a question of whether there are American Indians or Alaska Natives present in our communities. It's a question of whether we engage with them. And more importantly, or most importantly, do so appropriately and respectfully. So this brings us to this partnership framework. I made it simple, it's recursive and thoughtful. And before I dive into the details of it, the other goal that I had with this was to provide that broad approach, right? That's useful for not just research, right, where you're looking to publish or collect data. It's also useful for just general outreach and extension purposes, where you're just trying to create those relationships. So, before getting into the details of it, I want to talk a little bit about how I developed it. So, the framework I'm discussing today didn't emerge from a single source. Rather, it developed through three areas that really inform my thinking. That's the historical and present context of Native people, of course, the literature and dialogue that I've been able to fortunately have with Native professionals. So first, I want to establish a stronger understanding of the history of tribal partnerships and Native experiences with institutions. Now, for some, that history may already be familiar. For others, understanding that context as kind of a little bit of a baseline can help explain why certain barriers exist and why relationship building often takes time. And I also want to understand the contemporary issues within Indian country, particularly those affecting agriculture. Topics like data sovereignty, food sovereignty, rematriation, and decolonization. And all these help to provide insight to, our community's current priorities and concerns. Second, I conducted a literature review. As I mentioned earlier, or as I may not have mentioned earlier, I've been long interested in community-based participatory research, or CBPR. Many of you are likely familiar with this approach or similar approaches through the work that we do in Extension, public health, or NASH-funded centers. I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with the concept of One Health, and at its core, CBPR really emphasizes working with communities rather than simply working on communities. It's about that reciprocal relationships that we have to the people that we're serving. So while much of the literature that I reviewed for this focused on the ethical research practices with Native communities, right? Many of the principles translated well beyond research and informed how I thought about outreach and partnership development. And so finally, I had the opportunity to engage in dialogue with Native educators, researchers, and practitioners through the Society of Indian Psychologists. So I'm a member of SIP, and I've taken those opportunities to engage with these people to, how do we conduct research, or even how do we create partnerships within these communities from a Native's perspective? And a lot of these conversations provided, those valuable perspectives from people who not only worked within their own Native communities, but also within larger, academic institutions. So, taken together, the historical context, the literature, and the conversations that I've had, they really help shape the framework I'm presenting here. So, one, to be broadly applicable to those who may not be publishing, but rather just extending resources to a growing part of the agricultural community. Um, so, with that being said, I know we didn't come here to necessarily just hear about a theoretical approach to creating partnerships. Next, I want to really talk about this framework in action and how I really leveraged it in the work that I've done. And so, in this next part here, I'll really be highlighting three specific examples through the last few years of this project. So, this is a critical step, oversight. And again, it looks different on who you're connecting with and even your own organization. So, oversight began for us at our university. So, like our host, the Great Lakes Center here, we are part of a larger university system. And often there are guidelines our universities want us to adhere to in our process. So, in our case, I started connecting with our Vice President of Indigenous and Native American Affairs. And so this initial process of oversight was really more about communication and informing, as those guidelines, were still kind of a work in progress. So for the Intertribal Agricultural Council, or IAC, or the Intertribal Buffalo Council, or the ITBC, these were the organizations that I was partnering with in these examples. And these were organizations that really represent different tribes. So this means that oversight looks different from working with say, a single community versus a intertribal organization. So oversight in this context, working with those intertribal organization was more of a active collaborative process. And it took place over, a handful of meetings where we set about talking about expectations of what that partnership is, our goals. And of course, this takes time, but however, it is very valuable in building that much needed rapport. Now, in contrast, another example that I would like to share, working with a Colorado tribe, the Ute Mountain Ute. Now, this was something where we did not have an ultimate outcome, but it also serves, I think, as an important reminder that not all efforts will lead to an outcome. When you go into the process of trying to build these relationships with tribal stakeholders, sometimes due to various reasons, and I'll talk about that in more detail later on in this presentation, that, doesn't ultimately result in an outcome. So, in this case, I identified an existing trusted partner, an extension agent who works with this community. And through them, our oversight began with presenting a brief summary of our goals and desire to connect with their agricultural community at a council meeting. So, at the council meeting, this overview of kind of the work that we're interested in doing was positively received. So that greenlit us to start moving forward with our outreach efforts. And so this type of oversight illustrates the respect that should be paid to a community's sovereignty. As I mentioned before, sovereignty is an important thing to Native communities. And when we think about councils within these contexts, right, they have an obligation to protect the interests of the community members. So when working within a Native community like a reservation, this is an important place to start before you start reaching out to community members. So the next piece of this framework is use of a facilitator. So in some cases, your process might actually start here. A facilitator can be someone with insights or direct connection or indirect connection to the people you're looking to work with. They can help bridge those differences of perspectives that may exist between your organization and the tribal stakeholders. So for our work with the IAC and ITBC, it followed our initial oversight step with our university. I connected with a actual former uh, Intertribal Agricultural Council representative at a conference, and from there they helped facilitate that connection to this organization. And with the Intertribal Buffalo Council, I connected with a trusted partner through the Central State Center, who partners with them on their annual safety roundtable. And in all these cases, you're approaching these partnerships through existing connections, which is preferable to, say, cold calling or just kind of showing up as a stranger. These facilitators, trusted community members, or partners can be really helpful in a stepping off on the right foot. So again, this is a recursive process, meaning that from here, I return to establishing those guidelines of oversight with these organizations through those handful of meetings. Now, the next parts of this process, mainly the community-driven context or the framing community concerns and the planning, is really the collaborative, actionable steps in this partnership. So again, with community-led approaches, the goal is to work with stakeholders, not on stakeholders. It's identifying the present context of the tribal stakeholder, which is listening more than talking. So important areas like what is their capacity, what are the resources that they have available, and is there an actual interest in the partnership? So after establishing, then the actionable work begins. And it's not prescriptive, it's collaborative, where you work together to find that overlap between your resources and that community's needs. Now, in the case of the Intertribal Agricultural Council, over the course of several meetings, we discussed how they serve their member tribes and how we at HICAHS serve the overall agricultural communities. It was also understanding their capacity, gauging their interests, while understanding they're not obligated to us. So, in this way, we found the overlap between our resources and their needs. Whoops, sorry, I clicked ahead too soon. And that overlap looked like heat illness training. Um, so, a similar process was followed with the Intertribal Buffalo Council. However, um, it was my interest in farm stress that led to a presentation at one of those safety roundtables. From there, we began discussing, at the ITBC, their new apprenticeship program for herd management and how this topic might be beneficial there. So understanding community context is key when approaching these partnerships. This is where our connection with the Mountain Ute stakeholders did not move forward. Oftentimes, these communities are facing multiple demands for attention, so this is where patience is key. And in this example, working with the Ute Mountain Ute, it was the Colorado Department of Agriculture, it was Colorado State University, and it was other outside organizations that were vying for their time. So it's understanding that their capacity might be taxed with other partnerships, and understanding that context myself. I knew the challenge of communication was more about that limitation of time that they had. So we did not move forward with that partnership, having respect for the Ute Mountain Utes time on this. Now, you kind of seen that framework in action and kind of how I used it to guide my approach to establishing partnerships, but what were some of the outcomes that I want to highlight? So the first outcome that I want to highlight is our work with the Intertribal Agricultural Council, and this led to a heat illness presentation at their Southwest Regional Summit. And so, as you can imagine, this region within the Intertribal Agricultural Council, um, their producers deal with a lot of high temperatures, herd management, of course, making sure that their families and their workers are safe working within the heat. So this was well received by the members at that particular Southwest Regional Summit. So next, the collaboration with the Intertribal Buffalo Council led us to providing programming for their Buffalo Herd Management Apprenticeship Program. Now, this culminated into a webinar on farm stress and management through an Indigenous lens. And these were only limited examples of how this framework may be leveraged. Now, there are parallels I want to mention in the overall process of outreach work and rural communities and Native communities. So, while today I'm focusing on tribal stakeholders, much of what I'm discussing today can be applied broadly to many communities and many different stakeholders. So, this work has really, truly been very rewarding for me, and it's also been a very enlightening project. So, I want to finish off today's presentation with talking about some brief takeaways from this project. So, at the end of the day, this process, this creating partnerships with tribal communities, is about building community. There is a larger agricultural community, and how do we get resources out to everybody that may benefit from it? So this is something that takes time, patience, and resources. And it's important that throughout this process, you don't take it personal. In our own organizations, we have flux, we have change, and we have things that may kind of add some time to a project. And it goes no different than anybody else that you're working with. Um, and one thing to recognize is that, especially when you're working with tribal stakeholders, do they have the resources to even support a partnership? That is to say that even if you create a tool that is useful and beneficial to a particular community, do they have somebody there to help put that tool out there? Or is that something you need to account for in what you're providing for them? And of course, always bring your sense of humor. There's like been a ton of laughing along the way, and you don't know humor like native humor. And of course, I think this is critically important, especially in our increasingly pluralistic world, is don't wait for a community insider. There's valuable growth in yourself when you're trying to navigate these types of partnerships, to kind of bridge two differences in perspective. And at the end of the day, um, when it comes to working with tribal communities, organizations, there is by far so much more that we are alike than there is different. Um, and finally, one thing I mentioned at the beginning there is that, working through a trusted partner, there's almost always a connection that, through a friend, through a coworker, that can help facilitate that connection with a stakeholder that you might be interested in. And I think it's important that we make ourselves open to that and to those conversations. Now, beyond that, my name is Tim Porter. There's my email. I'm still at the High Plains Intermountain Center for Agricultural Health and Safety, and I want to give a huge thank you to the Great Lakes Center here for hosting myself, but also I want to give a huge thanks to all my supporters at HICAHS. Whitney Pennington has been a huge resource throughout this entire process with this project, and so has Dr. Lorian Stallings and help with her guidance as well. So beyond that, at this time, I will go ahead and stop sharing, and I will open up to questions. There we go.
Thank you so much, Tim. That was amazing. Does anybody have any questions that they have for Tim?
I have a question.
Please. Hi.
Um, Hey Tim, it was great to hear what you've been up to, and I hope you'll be at our next roundtable too. I'll send you an email about that. Um, I'm curious about how you have what you've been hearing from in this work on how engaging in certain agricultural practices, especially bringing back old ways through the practice of rediscovering, then have you seen that be healing for folks? Or is that something that you're hearing outside of, when we were talking about the buffalo harvest? I hear that a lot.
Absolutely. It's a huge part of a lot of the work that I'm interested in, like in psychology. I talk about resiliency. How do we kind of build that within, especially our youth? And when it comes to like a larger process like buffalo rematriation amongst several tribes, it's that reconnecting with the roots, with cultures, with ways that were, not quite lost, but we didn't have the ability to facilitate those types of practices. But the fact that we can engage with those again has provided a really huge resource, not just like from the perspective of food sovereignty, feeding your community, but also from a spiritual and mental health perspective as well. So yes, stuff like that is critically important and valuable to people who have had the opportunity. Um, but yes, thank you. I appreciate it, Miss Tara.
I have a question. Thank you so much for your presentation. Really beautiful and enlightening for me. I don't know very much about any of what you spoke about, so that was really great. Um, so we're a Center for Agricultural Safety and Health, NIOSH funded. We're in the state of Illinois, which has a pretty small American Indian farming population. What would you recommend to us if we wanted to reach out and engage with work that they might be interested in, or ways that we could connect with that community?
I think one thing that a good entry point is kind of as I mentioned in the presentation, is like seeing if there's anybody within your existing network that has those relationships with that community that are either members of it or maybe work through extension. But also, I find that a lot of these communities have some sort of land management arm of their government. And I've had the opportunity to speak with different people who work in land management for various tribes, and often they can be a great resource when it comes to like getting an initial feel of kind of like would there be an interest? Is this something worth pursuing? Um, but yeah, I think first start looking within the organization. You know, there's probably people that have connection somehow in some way to these communities, and then from there, you know, maybe reaching out to like something like a Bureau of Land Management for that community. But also, you know, again, with my framework, beginning with understanding what is that local context, what's that local history, because often, you know, there's going to be some nuance that's going to be worth knowing that can help guide a more successful, you know, kicking off of that partnership. Thank you,
Thank you.
Linda.
Thanks.
Hi, Tim. I'm very sad that you're about to be leaving us. Um, but I wonder, given that, how are you going to take, or what lessons or learnings will you take from the last 4 years of working on this project or working with HICAHS into your career ahead, looking at graduate school and then professional life after that?
Yes, thank you, Whitney. Um, you know, I went into that project kind of like with right on the heels of learning about participatory action research, you know, and this type of research that a lot of people working with Native communities, especially when it comes to like qualitative type research, where voices might be better heard through that type of research versus quantitative. And that kind of what spurred me kind of approaching you guys with this project idea. And truly, it was a learning experience. There was a huge learning curve. Um, but I think the biggest thing that I'm going to be taking with me going into graduate school is honestly just talking to people. I love the entire process of meeting new people, hearing about their experiences, what's important. And I think like just my natural interest, natural knack of just having an interest in people really helped that process. And that's something that was really continued to develop throughout these last few years. And that's something I think that I'll be taking with me to University of Alaska. And that work will continue. That program is a clinical community PhD, so that not only is there a clinical practicum to it, there's also a community practicum. So I will be spending quite some time doing advocacy or some related work. And then finally, how is it going to help me in my future after college? Well, my whole goal with returning to school is just to provide like more representative type research that is, you know, from the community for the community. And I think this has really been a huge help with, well, what does that look like step by step? And it's been really nice to be able to actually just have a structure to this process instead of thinking about it in theoretical terms to actually have been able to go out and do it. Yeah, thank you, Whitney.
Does anybody have any other questions before we close this meeting out? I have one, Tim, on kind of the culture and what role does culture play in, you know, this community that you interact with, and like specifically mental health wise, you know, are there any cultural aspects of that that you should consider throughout this process?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question. Um, so I've taken I've had a long interest in philosophy. You know, how do our worldviews shape how we approach our scientific understanding of the world around us? How do they influence our perspectives on what is it to be ethical? And I think culture, you know, is at the root of that. And when I think about that, so-called Western approach to like scientific research, that is a cultural interpretation. When you think about objectivity, that is rooted in a cultural perspective. And I think it's important to note that when you're working with different communities where the culture might seem a bit different, that you are also coming from your own unique culture. And there's a lot of commonality in there between that. But in terms of like how culture specifically shapes like maybe some Native communities, I don't necessarily always like to paint with a broad brush because Native communities are extremely diverse. But some of the common threads that we see throughout these types of perspectives is one, this idea of reciprocity, right? Um, it's one, from an agricultural perspective that you take from the earth, you grow, you get sustenance, and you also give back to the earth. It's the same approach in relationships. So this partnership is a huge thing too. What does reciprocity look like in professional organizations? How do we execute that? And so from that perspective, it's that give and take. And of course, it's patience. And in terms of like mental health, I think we're getting closer to a lot of probably common threads with this One Health approach. It's this idea that mental health isn't this what you would call a uh, Cartesian sort of philosophy of like the mind and the body, right? There's only one health, there is only one peace, and you're not in good health unless you have like a harmony between all these kind of separate pieces. So when we talk about mental health, or when I presented on mental health, for example, for the ITBC, there's that trend of like take care of your mind, but taking care of your mind is also you take care of it by taking care of your body, going out for walks, and also community, making sure you're engaging in community. And sometimes mental health is that, you got too wound up in work and you kind of neglected the spiritual side of yourself and you need to re-engage with that. So, I think those are some of the common things that you'll see in terms of like the influence of culture over perspectives and kind of how we may operate. But yeah, thank you, Danielle.
Thank you. That was great. Just for some housekeeping, this presentation has been recorded and it will be uploaded to our YouTube and our website. So if anybody wants to look at it at a later time or share it with anybody of interest, please feel free to do so. I'll send it out via email so you guys can have the link. But yeah, if there aren't any more questions, I think we can end. And thank you so much again, Tim. This was fascinating, and we so appreciate you spending the time with us and going through this.
Of course, thank you. And thank you everybody else for attending. I appreciate it.
Okay, I'm going to